Chapter 15 of Four Girls at Chautauqua. Four Girls at Chautauqua by Pansy. Chapter 15 Great Men. Ruth Erskine, with her skirts gathered daintily around her, to avoid contact with the unclean earth, made her way skillfully through the crowd, and with the aid of a determined spirit and a camp chair, secured a place and a seat very near the stand. The little lady who timidly followed in her lead was not quite so fortunate, inasmuch as she had no camp chair, and was less resolved in her determination to get ahead of those who had arrived earlier. So she contented herself with a damp seat on the end of a board, which was vacated for her use by a courteous gentleman. Ruth, you must understand, was not selfish in this matter because she had planned to be, but simply because it had never occurred to her to be otherwise, which is one of the misfortunes that come to people who are educated in a selfish atmosphere. Ruth Erskine had come to this meeting fully prepared to enjoy it. Dr. Cuyler was a star of sufficient magnitude to attract her. During her frequent visits to New York she had heard much of, but had never seen him. The people whom she visited were too elegant in their views and practices to have much in common with the church which was so pronounced on the two great questions of religion and temperance. Yet even with them, Dr. Cuyler and Dr. Cuyler's great church were eccentricities to be tolerated, not ignored. Therefore Ruth had had it in her heart to enjoy listening to him some time. The sometime had arrived. She had dressed herself with unusual care, a ceremony which seemed to be quite in the background among the people who were at home at Chautauqua. But someway it seemed to Ruth that the great Brooklyn pastor should receive this mark of respect at her hands. So she had spent the morning at her toilet, and was now a fashionable lady, fashionably attired for church. If the people who vouchsafed her a glance as she crowded past indulged, some of them, in a smile at her expense, and thought the simple temple made of trees and grasses an inappropriate surrounding to her silken robes and costly lace mantle, she was none the wiser for that, you know, and took her seat, indifferent to them all, except that presently there stole over her the sense of disagreeable incongruity with her outdoor surroundings. So Satan had the pleasure of ruffling her spirits and occupying her thoughts with her rich brown silk dress, instead of letting her heart be touched with the solemnity and beauty of the grand hymn which rolled down those long aisles. Satan has that everlasting weapon, what to wear and what not to wear, everlastingly at command and wonderfully under his control. But Ruth, in her way, was strong-minded and could control her thoughts when she chose, so she presently shook off the feeling of annoyance and decided to give herself up to the influences of the hour. By this time Dr. Cuyler appeared and was introduced. Ruth gave him the benefit of a very searching gaze, and decided that he was the very last man of all those on the platform whom she would have selected as the speaker. Probably if Dr. Cuyler had known this, and known also that his personal presence entirely disappointed her, he would not have been greatly disconcerted thereby. But his subject was one that found an answering thrill in this young lady's heart. Some talks I have had with great men. Ruth liked greatness. In her calm, composed way she bowed before it. She would have enjoyed being great. Celebrity in a majestic, dignified form would have been her delight. She by no means admitted this, as Eurie Mitchell so often did. She by no means sought after it in the small ways within her reach. Small ways did not suit her; they disgusted her. But if she could have flashed into splendid greatness, if by any amount of laborious study, or work, or suffering, she could have seen the way to world-wide renown, she would have grasped for it in an instant. The next best thing to being renowned oneself was to have renowned people for friends. This was another thing that Ruth coveted in silence. She wanted no one to know how earnestly she aspired to, sometime, making the acquaintance of some of the great people, not the vulgarly great, those who were in a sense, and in the eyes of a few, great because of the accidents of fortune and travel. She knew such by the scores. Indeed, she had been in circles many a time where she shone with that sort of greatness herself. Perhaps it was for that reason that it was such a despised height to her. But she meant the really great people of this world, people of power, people who moved the masses by the force of their brains. Not one such had she ever met to look upon as an acquaintance; and here was this man telling off the honored names by the score, and saying, "My friend Dr. Guthrie," "My good friend Thomas Carlyle," "My dear brother Newman Hall." How would it seem to stand in intimate relationship with one single gifted mind like these, and was she destined ever to know by actual experience? There was another reason why Ruth had desired to choose Dr. Cuyler to listen to rather than some other names on the program, because, from the nature of his subject, she had judged it most unlikely that he should have about him any arrows that would touch home to her. Not that she put it in that language; she did not admit even to herself that any of the solemn words that had been spoken at Chautauqua had reference to her; and yet in a vague, fitful way she was ill at ease. She had moments of feeling that there was a reach of happiness possessed by these people of which she knew nothing. Little side thrusts had come to her from time to time, in places where she least expected them. That question, asked by Flossy during her night of unrest, "Should you be afraid to die?" hovered around this quietly poised young lady in a most unaccountable manner. All the more persistently did it cling because she could not shake it off with the thought that it was silly. Common sense told her that the strange, solemn shadow which came so steadily after men, and so surely enveloped one after another among the grandest intellects that the world owned, was not a thing to pass over lightly. After all, why should she not be afraid of death? Then that strange gentleman who had persisted in ranking her among the praying people. He had left his shadow. Why did she not pray? She wondered over this in a vague sort of way; wondered how it seemed to kneel down alone, and speak to an invisible presence; wondered if those who so knelt always felt as though they were really speaking to God. There were times when Ruth was exceedingly disgusted with these perplexing thoughts, and wanted nothing so much as to get away from them. She resented this intrusion upon her quiet. This day was one of those in which she was impatient of all these things, and she had made her toilet with great satisfaction, and said within herself complacently, "We are to have 1 hour at last devoted to this mundane sphere and the mortals who inhabit it. Most of the time these Chautauquans talk and act as though earth was only a railroad station, where people changed cars and went on to heaven. Dr. Cuyler is going to refresh us with some actual living specimens of humanity. He can't make a sermon out of that subject if he tries." But Ruth Erskine had not measured the power of the earnest preachers of Jesus Christ. As if Dr. Cuyler could talk for an hour to thousands of immortal souls, and leave Christ and heaven and immortality out. To Ruth these 3 words constituted a sermon, and she got them that day. Not that he had an idea that he was preaching Christ, except incidentally, as a man refers almost unconsciously to the one whom he loves best in all the world, but Ruth knew he was. It came in little sudden touches when she least expected it, when heart and soul were wrought upon with some strong enthusiasm by the splendid picture of a splendid man, as when he told of Spurgeon. It was a glowing description, such as thrilled Ruth, and made her feel that to have just one glimpse of that great man, with his great marvelous power over humanity, would be worth a lifetime. Suddenly the speaker said, "The secret of that man's power lies, first, in his study of the Bible." Ruth started and came down like a bombshell from her wondrous height. The Bible, copies of which lay carelessly on every table of her father's elegantly furnished house, unstudied and unthought of. How very strange to ascribe the power of the great intellect to the study of one book that was more or less familiar to every Sunday school boy. Second, in short, simple, homely language. Ruth smiled now. Dr. Cuyler was growing absurd, as if it were not the most common thing in the world to use simple, homely language. No Spurgeons could be manufactured in that way, she was sure. Third, mighty earnestness to save souls. Here was a point concerning which Ruth knew nothing. Dr. Cuyler's manner put tremendous force into the forceful words, and carried conviction with them. She wondered how a really mighty earnestness to save souls made a man appear. She wondered whether she had ever seen such a one. She went rapidly over the list of her acquaintances in the church. She smiled to herself a sarcastic, contemptuous smile. She had met them all at parties, concerts, festivals, and the like. She had seen them on occasions when nothing seemed to possess them but to have a good time like the rest of the world. Like the rest of the world, Ruth reasoned and decided from her chance meetings with the outside life of these Christians, forgetting that she had never seen one of them in their closets before God. Rather, she knew nothing about these closets, nor the experiences learned there, and could only reason from outside life. This being the case, what a pity that her verdict of those lives should have called forth only that contemptuous smile. Wandering off in this train of thought, she lost the speaker's next point, but was called back by his solemn, ringing close. Put these together, melt them down with the love of Christ, and you have a Spurgeon. God be thanked for such a piece of handwork as he. Another start and another retrospect. Did she know any people who put these together, who made a real, earnest, constant study of the Bible as schoolgirls learned their Latin grammars, and who were really eager to save souls because they had the love of Christ in their hearts, and who said so in plain, simple language? Does he, I wonder? She said to herself. I wonder if his sermons sound like that. I should like to hear him preach just once. Oh dear, if he isn't running off to Moody and Sankey! It is a sermon after all. On the whole, Ruth was disgusted. Her brain was in a whirl. She was being compelled to hear sermons on every hand. She was sick of it. They had been great men of whom she had heard, and she admired them all. She wanted the secret of their power, but she didn't want it to be made out of such commonplace material as was in the hands of every child. She did not know what she wanted, only that she had come out to be entertained and to revel in her love of heroes, and she had been pinned down to the one thought that real men were made of those who found their power in their Bible and on their knees. The solemn, earnest, tender closing to this address did not lessen her sense of discomfort. Then just beside her was carried on a conversation that added to her annoyance. "They are big men," a man said. He was dressed in a common business suit. His linen had not the exquisite freshness about it that her fastidious eyes delighted in. His hands looked as though they might have been used to work that was rough and hard. His straggling hair was sprinkled with gray, and there was not a striking feature about him. "They are big men," he said, "and I've no doubt it is a big thing to know them, and talk with them, and have a friendly feeling for each, as if they belonged to him, but he knows a bigger one than them, and the best of it is, so do we. The Lord Jesus Christ, our elder brother, is not to be compared to common men like these." And now Ruth's lips curled utterly. She was an aristocrat without knowing it. She believed in Christianity, and in its power to save the poor and the commonest, but this insufferable assumption of dignity and superiority over the rest of the world, as she called it, was hateful to her in the extreme. It would have startled her exceedingly to have been told that she was angry with the man for presuming to place his friend higher in the list of great ones than any of those given that day. And yet such was actually her feeling. She swept her skirts angrily away from contact with the man, and spoke so crustily to the little lady who had come in her wake that she moved timidly away. Just at her left were two gentlemen shaking hands. Both had been on the stand together, she knew the faces of both, and one ranked just a trifle higher in her estimation than any one at Chautauqua. She edged a little nearer. She lived in the hope of making the acquaintance of some of these lights, just enough acquaintance to receive a bow and a clasp of the hand, though how one could accomplish it who was determined that her interest in them should never be seen nor suspected, it would be hard to say. But they were talking in eager, hearty tones, not at all as if their words were confidential, at least she might have the benefit of them. "That was a capital lecture," the older of the two was saying. "Cuyler has had great advantages in his life in meeting on a familiar footing so many of our great men. When you get thinking of these things, and of the many men whom you would like to know intimately, what is the thought that strikes you most forcibly?" "That I am glad I belong to the royal family, and have the opportunity of knowing intimately and holding close personal relations with Him who spake as never man spake. The other answered in a rare, rich tone of suppressed jubilance of feeling. "Exactly," his friend said. "And when you can leave the fulness of that thought long enough to take another, there is the looking forward to actual fellowship and communion not only with Him, but with all these glorious men who are living here, and who have gone up yonder." Ruth turned abruptly away. The very thought that possessed the heart of the plain looking man and that so annoyed her; and these two, whom to know was an honor, were looking forward to that consummation as the height of it all. CHAPTER XVI.